birth, as you can hear, but I've lived in Europe since 2005 continuously.
You're in Bonn now, okay. I see.
Okay, are we on?
Yes.
Welcome, slightly belatedly, to a Bruegel discussion of the data economy. And I'm joined today by Commissioner Thierry Breton and by Maximilian Schrems, neither of whom need introduction, but I suppose I should introduce them in any case. In talking today, we're going to be talking about the data economy. Now, in real estate, by comparison, one typically says that there are only three things that matter. The first is location, the second is location, and the third is location. With the digital economy, one could just as well say that the three things that matter are data, data, and data. And that's what we're talking about today. There are different kinds of data. There's personal data, there's non-personal data, industrial data, public sector data. And providing optimal access to those for industry, for government, and for individuals is crucial. And yet, at the same time, it's important to preserve the privacy of personal data. Mr. Schrems, who is with us today, is really emblematic in the fight to ensure privacy of personal data, not just against commercial interests, but also against intrusive government surveillance. The two cases that carry his name, Schrems 1 and Schrems 2, were entirely about overarching US government surveillance. So this certainly will be one of the aspects we'll be talking about, arrangements with the US, what's likely with the UK if we get or don't get an agreement on the future relationship. Will we see an adequacy decision? Will an adequacy decision even be judicially sustainable? But then on a much broader scope, a much more important scope relative to European industry and to the industrial renaissance that we seek in Europe, Mr. Breton, I'm sure, will be speaking about access to industrial data, non-personal data, public sector data. Commissioner Breton and his directorates have been really driving efforts to make all of this data more accessible, to facilitate and promote sharing. They issued a data strategy in February. Mr. Breton, Commissioner Breton, has been regularly speaking on the topic since. And that, I think, will be a particular topic for today, especially also as we're due for announcements in the coming weeks for a Digital Services Act, a Digital Markets Act, and I expect something to be out on data probably in the near term, or one hopes. It seems that it's about time. If I may, recognizing that you're not a cook, but I'm curious to know what's been cooking in the Commission's kitchen as regards data. And with that, over to you, Commissioner Breton.
Well, thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you for all of you to be here, and thank you very much, dear Mr. Schrems, to be able to engage with you today on this topic. Yes, it's true that we are working very hard as a Commission for the data economy, but to tell you the truth, I should confess that I didn't wait to be a commissioner to work with data, to think about data. It has been my life, in fact. It happens that now I'm the regulator. So yes, since the very first day I joined the Commission, by the way, it's almost exactly 1 year ago, if I may say so. I have worked extremely hard with my team to be able to present this coherent data strategy for Europe. And by the way, that we will announce as early as today for the Data Governance Act, but I will come back very quickly on this point. My starting point is that after the first wave of personal data that we experienced over the last 10 years, we need to prepare the second wave, as you mentioned, of the one of the industrial data. And when I say industrial, of course, it's not only about industry or companies, it's also public. It is all the data that we will have in our life, not personal data, but the one that we will create and generate. And by the way, if we look at the data that we have today on the planet Earth today is the equivalent of 40 zettabytes of data. In other words, 40,000 billion of data. And guess what? Through this industrial data evolution or revolution, call it the way you want, we will now multiply this number of data by 2 every 18 months. In other words, sort of a Moore's law, so that at the end of my mandate, by end of 2024, planet Earth will be not anymore 40 zettabyte of data, but 180 zettabyte of data, 4 times higher. So you can imagine everything that will happening very quickly. This is why we don't have 1 minute to lose. That I started to work the very first day here to be able to discuss, to present what we will discuss today. In fact, if I would like to summarize in a nutshell, I will say that the battle for industrial data is starting now, and the battlefield may be Europe. So yes, we need to get ready, and this is my objective. Of course, in doing so, we are not starting from zero. We have all the experience of the first wave, and with GDPR, probably the most advanced regulation worldwide protecting the privacy of our fellow citizens while empowering them with their data. We have been brave enough to set our rules in the personal data sphere, and this is what we need to do now for government and public and industrial data. Set the rules, the European rules. Everybody will be welcome, of course, in Europe. That's extremely important, provided they respect our rules. And in this endeavor, I believe, Mr. Schrems, your fight for privacy and for the respect of the principles underpinning GDPR are part of a preoccupation which is legitimate. How European data are going to be used and shared? Who will get access to them? Do I have the guarantee that my rights will prevail? It is certainly not up to me to discuss the latest court case, its consequences, and the ongoing efforts to overcome them. This is in the remit of my colleague Didier Renders. But beyond this, I would rather like to expand the discussion and try to see what are the lessons learned at a point where we are defining a regulatory environment for government and industrial data. Because in the end, the worries expressed by Mr. Schrems and confirmed, by the way, by the court are, in my view, not limited to privacy and personal data. These worries are, in fact, at the heart of the single market for data that I am building, and I put in perspective this huge amount of data that I was referring to in my introductory remarks. These worries are clear. In the world we are entering, one, individuals or companies want to keep control over its data. This perspective, my objective is to set up a single market for data, open, but sovereign. I know very well that the value of data is when they are shared. That's extremely important. When they flow, that's paramount. But I consider that not all the data are the same in terms of their sensitivity. The personal data regulation, GDPR, is a proof of that. We have considered, and rightly so, that privacy and personal data should be better protected. And the court just reminded that. I know that other parts of the world are adopting the same kind of approach. Going forward, there are also sensitive industrial data that should benefit from specific conditions when they are accessed, used, or shared. This is the case, for instance, for some sensitive public data, like, for example, from public hospitals, health, but also for anonymized data that remain sensitive, mixed data which are difficult to handle. And I want our SMEs and startups, our public hospitals, our cities, and many other across actors to use more data, to make them available, to value them, to share them. But for this, we need to generate the trust is the key word, that is necessary within the single market to open them. We should not be mistaken. When speaking about data, we actually speak about the foundation of our European industrial policy. This is about the digital transition of our industries and our societies at large. And in this perspective, I am acting on 4 pillars. The first pillar is the Data Governance Act, by the way, which the Commission will adopt this afternoon and presented tomorrow. With this act, we are defining a European approach to data sharing. This new regulation will facilitate data sharing across sectors and member states, and will put those who generate the data in the driving seat, moving away from the current practices of the big tech platforms. Concretely, with this legislation, we create the conditions to allow access to and reuse of sensitive public data, creating a body of harmonized rules for the single market. To build trust, we foresee that European highly sensitive data should be able to be stored and processed in the EU in full respect of our international commitment, which is extremely important. Without such possibility, member states will never agree to open their data vault. This is a clear element that explains that while being an open continent, we are not naive. We also create a framework for the emergence of new data players in Europe, data brokers, whose role will be to connect the data owners of the data users, and this in a neutral manner. They are the basis for future personal data spheres, digital twins, which would empower the individual of the companies to have a stronger control of their data. We are shifting here the paradigm. And we promote also data altruism, the voluntary sharing of data, industrial or personal, for common good. One important element is our proposal today, is its shielding provision. The data actors will have to take the necessary measures to avoid having to comply with abusive and unlawful access requests of data held in Europe from third country authorities. This is a major point. It is not a question of calling into question our international judicial or policy cooperation. We cannot tolerate abuses, not authorize access that do not offer sufficient legal guarantees or fishing expeditions. By doing so, we are ensuring that the European law and the guarantees it carries is respected. This is about enforcing our own rules. The second pillar is the regulation of the platform is the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act. I will be very quick because it is not exactly the DSA, so-called Digital Service Act, will put a clear responsibility and obligation on platforms and the content they spread. The DMA on its side is an ex-ante regulation which will frame the behaviors of gatekeepers or systemic actors in the single market and target their abusive behaviors against their competitors or customers. The third pillar I will present in 2021 will be a Data Act. This legislative initiative will aim at increasing fairness in the data economy by clarifying data usage rights in business to business and business to government settings. We will also consider enhanced data portability rights to give individuals more control, which is extremely important, over the data they produce. And we will have a look at the intellectual property of rights framework. So before concluding, as I mainly discuss a regulatory aspect this morning, I want to signal that for Europe to be a credible actor in the data economy, we need, of course, to invest also massively in key infrastructures. And you heard me many times speaking about European industrial cloud, capacity of computing power, HPC, connectivity, space-based connectivity, quantum encryption, and so on. So we will, of course, push this very hard. And to conclude, I would like to say that Europe has everything it takes to lead the global race for data and industrial data and technological power. It is the world's #1 industrial continent. And that's why, by the way, everybody is looking at what's happening here in Europe. And it is a guarantee of respect of fundamental rights and values for both individuals and companies. We should take our own destiny into our hands to make Europe the most data-empowered continent in the world. That's my ambition. This will require, of course, political vision that we have and willingness that I believe we have too. Smart regulation, hopefully you will judge, to set the right rules and investment in key infrastructure. This is how I see the future of our data continent, and I look forward discussing with Mr. Schrems on this extremely important matter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner Breton, for these inspiring remarks. I know you described yourself at the outset as now being the regulator, but I think I hear a much broader policy focus here and a really more inspiring industrial policy view for Europe as a whole. And we're very much honored to be among the very first to hear about the new measures that are hopefully about to be implemented by the college. Over to you, Mr. Schrems, before we go further. I'd be interested in your thoughts. I'll certainly be interested in your thoughts on personal data, but I'd also appreciate some responses to what we just heard, to this rather inspiring message. So over to you.
I'll try to cut it short, given that we're a little bit late from the beginning. So I think from at least from the outset, what the topic was generally is kind of what I'm really interested in is the question of like free flow of data and how that compares to like equal rights and so on. Because one fundamental problem we have right now, I think, is this whole level playing field idea that I think in Europe is very common, but just globally not that much. and that gets really interesting. I mean, obviously my cases were there on the data protection side of things, but if we are in a globalized internet, there's going to be way more topics, obviously, that will suffer the same problem, that we simply work on totally different standards and how we cope with that, how we partly then protect data industries, etc. And on the other hand, try to also get free data flows. And I think that is kind of interesting because, you know, my name, I usually call these cases the Safe Harbor and the Privacy Shield case, not the Schrems 1 or 2 cases. But I think both of them are usually more seen as a blockade to like data transfers. And I don't think they should be. They could be a tipping point about how to think how we can regulate stuff properly so that stuff stays fair in the end. So I think this conflict of law issue is the really interesting one. And that can be, you know, stuff like freedom of speech, which is a wonderful example where, for example, Europe is usually a bit more, you know, limited as the US. There is a lot of topics about monopolies that I think are extremely important from a European perspective, from a business side, but also from a consumer side, because we have, I think, fundamentally a different view of what a free market is in the EU than in the US. In the US, we have more the idea of there is a runoff phase where whoever has the most money from their backers is going to push everybody else off the market and then monopolize it. While in the US, in the EU, we usually have like more of a constant runoff phase. So stuff like open systems, interoperability, all these issues is stuff where I think we probably have a bit of a different understanding of things sometimes. And we have to find systems how to still work on that. And I think when the commissioner asked previously or mentioned previously the experiences we have with the GDPR, I think there are parts of the GDPR that made a lot of sense. It's definitely not the most well-crafted law the world has ever seen. We could have probably regulated the same with half that many words. But one thing that I think I just wanted to throw in from that experience a bit at the beginning right away is the question of enforceability, because one thing that we see a lot with the GDPR is we put these laws forward. We're very proud that we're, you know, the masters of fundamental rights and privacy in the world. But the reality is it's not enforced again. We have, for example, the main regulator in Europe is Ireland. There we have about 4,000 to 7,000 complaints a year and not a single fine so far, not even decisions. So right now you have a right to privacy, for example, in the GDPR. But if you want to enforce that in Ireland, statistically, only 1 of 100 complaints is even looked at. So you have it's a bit like having a right to vote and only 1% of the times your vote is actually looked at, then you don't really have a right to vote. So a lot of these things, I think we also have to debate a bit more, because one problem that we did have in the privacy sphere definitely is that we got, to a certain extent, again, a bit of a laughingstock in the sense of they announced all of these things really well, but then, and I want to stress that's not a European Union issue, that's mainly a member states enforcement issue. But I think we'll have to think about these things as well, because it's nice to have a lot of these things on paper, but then we also have to enforce stuff in the end. Yeah, one last thing on surveillance, because you mentioned that in your introductory part. I think obviously there we see how systems can be so fundamentally at odds that even as companies, you don't know how to comply with stuff. So best example is the US, obviously. There's a citizen-based idea of fundamental rights. So if you're not a US citizen or permanent resident, you're basically out. Obviously, that was on vogue 300 years or 200 years ago when the Bill of Rights was introduced, but not today anymore. So we have so many of these fundamental problems. And I think what's interesting is on the one hand, how we regulate that, but also how we get as many of the Western democratic, etc. countries on board to have a common set of rules, because otherwise we'll probably have Schrems 4, 5, 6 with some other name, hopefully in front of it. And again, have problems on these data flows. So that's, I think, the most important points that were on my little sheet of paper. The last point that I just wanted to throw out there as well is, I think, one point of the monopoly issue, which I think is something where we really kind of lacked so far in the European Union. There is a fundamental understanding in the US that you kind of try to occupy a market, keep everybody else out by having technical limits in the sense of, I cannot install an app on another operating system, all kind of technical limits that are not necessary. And it's interesting because we had in the European Union a very different economic approach to that. We usually opened up old networks, we had interoperability, so you really have the options to choose from 20 different internet providers in Europe, while in the US you usually have the one that, you know, put the cable in the ground. And I think there is a lot of like development in the internet that goes exactly the opposite of a free market, of a competitive market, and that rather goes into a monopolization. And I think there is an element where it's kind of interesting to me usually that we usually did it pretty right in other sectors. Like we can have, you know, gas from 20 different companies out of the same gas line. We can have, I don't know, trains running on each other, trains tracks and so on. But when it comes to digital services, we have a very kind of closely knit monopolized world. And I don't think that Europe will be able to compete with that, because globally, there's just more market power, more finances in the US. The only thing that we could probably carve something out is if we really push for these open and interoperable systems, because usually when it comes to any new app, there is a US provider that will just have pushed so much money in it that any other provider will be off the market. And I think that is an element where, without a lot of like protectionism or anything like that, just saying you have to have an open interface, then you have a real competition, we could probably gain a lot. That was like one of the things that I feel very strongly about. I just wanted to throw in there as a last point.
Well, if I may, I wouldn't be so quick to write off European industry or European capital. Where Europe tends to be weak is on equity capital in general and venture capital in particular. This is an area that I think needs more attention. But European industry as a whole is strong. European commerce, European GDP is actually taken as a whole is somewhat greater than that of the US. I wouldn't be so quick to throw away our chances. But I think some of the points that you raised, I think, are crucial. And what I also heard back to Commissioner Breton in just a second would be that I think what I heard was a very strong emphasis on the one hand, strengthening our data sharing and our industry, but doing it in ways that are respectful of individual privacy. One quick administrative question. Katja, we normally like to get question and answers from the audience. I don't see a Q&A panel here. So, and I would want to encourage the audience to give us questions, except I don't think I have a way to see them. So with that, over to you, Commissioner Breton.
No, thank you very much for this inspiring remarks, Mr. Schrems. I would like to tell a few things. The first thing is to understand exactly what I'm trying to do. We definitely need to organize what I call our digital space. And you know, if I look at how long it took for us to organize the physical space, was territorial, maritime, airspace, it took centuries. So we have to do the same thing, but much faster in this new dimension that we all understand we are living in now. And especially with this period, the COVID-19 crisis reminded us the importance of the digital space or informational space. And my mission here at the Commission, as a Commissioner for Internal Market and Digital Economy, is definitely to make sure that we start to put the right framework. So of course, we want again to set up the rules. And don't misunderstand. It's true that we have extremely big players, extremely powerful. That's another subject. With this set of regulation, I just want to set up the rules, and that the rules are clear, based on our values. And I will just take one example that I think Mr. Schrems mentioned, and which is extremely important: interoperability and portability. And we are working on this on several strands. The first is standards for interoperability. That's absolutely key for sectoral data spaces that we will create, and very important for data flows. We will you will see that we will create a European Innovation Data Board set in the DGA today, which will help the Commission in setting and working the right standards. Second, which is extremely important, avoiding locking effect and abusive behaviors by platforms and gatekeepers. And you will find all the regulation here in the DMA. So that's really something that is important. Another thing that Mr. Schrems mentioned was, and he was right, enforceability. That's very interesting that you say this, Mr. Schrems, because we can indeed build the perfect law, but it's difficult to apply it. And we saw this, and you mentioned it. And as an entrepreneur, I really understand this. So we need definitely clear, predictable, implementable rules. And this is what is driving me when regulating again the data market, but also that's what you will find behind the DSA and the DMA with an ex-ante regulation to be able to apply it immediately and everywhere in Europe, not only in one country, everywhere at the same time, just to be able to make sure that things are happening quick. In this digital space, we have to be fast. And for instance, what Mr. Schrems said about the role of one regulator, we have the same experience when we want to regulate platforms. That's the same thing. So we will again make sure in DSA that member state authorities can ask platform to remove immediately content cross-border. Like, for example, if you want to allow me this comparison, European arrest warrant. And of course, we will have also the cooperation at European level and the Commission to be able to step in. So again, you will see that we are putting rules. We are not naive. We understand pretty well where we have the bottleneck. And again, we try to regulate. And also in parallel, that's very important, because like everywhere, when you have some regulation, you need to have sanctions. So you will have appropriate sanctions because we will need to do this. We learn lessons from the GDPR. Thank you.
So if I could come back to you with a question or two about what you just raised. You talked a lot about sanctions within Europe and rules within Europe. One of the hallmarks of GDPR is extraterritorial application, in the sense that it also relates to foreign platforms, especially US platforms in practice, to the extent that they're offering services to European consumers. Now, with several of the measures that you talked about, including presumably where Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act are likely to go, application to foreign platforms, especially US, but potentially also Chinese and elsewhere. The question of how practical that will be, how enforceable it will be, and how far do we think we can realistically go with these approaches is, I think, an important question, and one that I'd really welcome your thoughts on.
No, I will be very quick because I don't want to, I think it will be interesting to listen to Mr. Schrems, but I just wanted to tell you that now in our DSA and DMA, everyone will be able to settle everywhere. I mean, Europe, you want to settle, you can settle everywhere in any country. But the the rules will be the same in any country. And by the way, you will need to have an official representative in Europe if you want to offer the services of your platform. So that we will be able, again, just to act quickly and to have somebody in front of us when we believe that that's an important part that we have to do something. You know, with GDPR, we have exported, if I may say so, our norms. But this was not the main aim, it was just to build our rules. We will do the same thing here. We just building our rules. They will be very large, very comprehensive, I hope very robust, and you know, we see what we want again is Mr. Schrems mentioned it. That's a level playing field. That's important. We believe that we will create a fair way to work in this digital space in Europe for our companies, our citizens, but also for others. If they want to know, to come, they will just have to fulfill our rules. And you know, we are building also a bridge. We know that what creates the value in the data economy is data sharing, and we will engage discussions, of course, with others if they want, like we did with GDPR, and we will build bridges. But in order to build a bridge, you need to have a pillar. So we will have to have a very strong pillar, clear pillar, readable, predictable. And guess what? We'll see what happens. But I will always push also to have a good level playing field in terms of data flow, because I know by experience it has been my job. You know, so I know what you can create and when you have to create using data. That's absolutely paramount. But you need to have again a regulatory space. And again, of course, Europe is probably the best place, I believe, to balance all the legitimate interest. And I will not forget also democracy and rule of law. Thank you.
Well said. And indeed, I think this is a very timely thrust, especially also as you have some winds of political change blowing in my country of birth, the United States, where actually I was a senior official at the Federal Communications Commission. This kind of initiative, I think, is very, very timely at a point when consumer attitudes, public attitudes towards privacy, toward the conduct of the platforms, and a renewed interest in enforcement of antitrust seem to be taking a more active role on the other side of the pond. Well, a question to Mr. Schrems. We're beginning to run a bit on our time, which unfortunately we started a bit late. But what do you see as the next frontiers in terms of individual empowerment and privacy and protection against inappropriate government surveillance? What are the next frontiers?
Excuse me, sorry, before Mr. Schrems replies, and apologies for interruption. Scott, could you kindly check the chat function? I inserted some questions from the audience there.
Thank you.
Yeah, just very quick on the question. I think for us itself and from a consumer perspective, one of the most interesting questions will be how much we can find systems like collective redress, etc., to even enforce the laws that we have. As I mentioned before, it's nice to have different rules. The question is, how do we enforce it? And from a consumer perspective, I mean, there is the collective redress directive that horizontally oftentimes gives you access to even enforcing these rights, because as an individual, I can give you an idea, Schrems 2 cost about 10 million euros in legal fees. So no one as a normal person will be able to do that unless you have some kind of access to justice, which again is a problem in certain member states. It would be much cheaper in one member state to litigate that than another. Back to the surveillance question, I think that's going to be one of the most problematic things. And I want to add, this is not just privacy. This is, sensitive information, espionage on EU institutions, industries, etc. And right now in practice, this is largely, if you talk about data sharing, a problem with the US, because most of our data is currently not held in China. But when you come to the security side, obviously, we have a lot more players there, which is definitely going to be a huge issue. I'm not an expert on the security side of it at all. But one thing I wanted to throw in here, I mean, I guess with some of the some of our partners, there is a fair argument to make to say, if you guys want to make a load of money with having European customers, then you also have to give them some basic rights and guarantees. It's not possible to say, pay us, give us all your data, but you're not going to have any rights once the data is abroad. I guess that's also a fair proposition to make, and I think we sometimes just have to be bolder on that, and just put that forward a bit more. One thing that I don't want to miss out on is there is also a lot of surveillance issues within the EU. So Article 4 of the treaty exempts national security from any EU legislation, but we have member states, certain member states, not all, that do have very, very big surveillance apparatuses themselves, and that are not falling under any of these EU laws that we know. So right now, as an Austrian, for example, if the German Secret Service puts us under surveillance, there's no place I can go within the EU other than probably Strasbourg to really get my rights. So it's kind of interesting that, for example, in these data flow issues, I could actually go to the Court of Justice over US surveillance, but I wouldn't be able to go to the Court of Justice about French, German, or UK surveillance. Squeezing in the UK question from the beginning, that would then be possible by the end of the year, that would actually have the same debate on data transfers that we have with the US right now than on the UK, which is going to be another headache, to be honest, how we can cope with that. But I hope I packed in as many points as made sense in your question.
No, but in fact, actually, you just began on the on one of the questions from the audience, which is, dear Mr. Schrems, do you have any plans to challenge a UK data adequacy agreement if the EU decides that the UK is adequate?
So we don't have any plans but that's a purely political thing I'm saying right now, is this whole Brexit saga is so crazy that I have no intention to put more fire into that existing kind of oil pile that's like burning up in flames there. But quite honestly, someone else will. So it's not too hard to just copy paste the arguments we made on the US on the UK. I'm not an expert on UK surveillance laws, but the colleagues that I know that work on it usually say that UK surveillance laws go beyond what the US is doing right now. So there is a fair argument to say if it's a problem with the US, why is it not a problem with the UK? Just as the US literally made that argument in these litigations before. They said, how can you say it's so troubling in the US, the surveillance, if your own member states do similar things, which was a fair point. Again, that goes back to Article 4 of the treaties, that the EU simply doesn't have jurisdiction about its own member states in that case, but only third countries, which is a bit of an odd thing, but that's what the member states decided when they drafted the treaties, I guess.
And indeed, once the UK, well, with the UK leaving or having left the EU, it now becomes a third country, so things get exciting. There are a number of questions from the audience about EDPB guidance, encryption requirements, and so on. One says, it's a wrecking ball to the EU's GDPR pillar that holds the bridge of protection to access the global data economy, end of EU data flows. Have either of you looked at the EDPB guidance? Do you have thoughts on it?
The guidelines from last week, I would assume.
Yes, I presume so, yes.
Yeah, so basically we're just starting to look into it. Quite honestly, what they say is what is expected. The law is like that since 1995. It is just that we have to prompt a large part of the industry, and a large part of, I think also the regulators have just ignored it so far. And what's really mind-blowing to me is that we need the Court of Justice to remind everybody in the room what the rules are, including sometimes the regulators, because they have also looked the other way. Yeah, I don't think that any of this is a wrecking ball or anything new. It's what the law said ever since. People have to realize that the GDPR and the predecessor basically said data has to stay in Europe unless you have a way to get it out in a legal way, and that doesn't exist right now.
Okay, a question for Commissioner Breton from Politico, Vincent Mononcourt. The question is, NGOs say your digital proposals, like the Data Governance Act, endanger the EU's legacy on data protection. So he wants to know what your response is. This is from Politico.
I believe it's the opposite, in fact. It's the opposite. You know, the Data Governance Act is definitely to make sure today, when you look at all the data that are produced by government or health organization and so on, member states keep this data today because they don't have the right framework to be able to and secure work and trusted environment to start to share this data. And you know, just to give you an example, during this very situation and the pandemic that we are all coping with, one of my mission is also to make sure that we can work together within the European single market, that we share information, including, by the way, some basic information like the shared occupancies in hospital or stuff like this. It was just impossible between member states because we had not the right framework on a secured way. So what we decided is that it was absolutely critical that that we will be able to find the right solution, so that member states will be encouraged to do this with anonymized data, making sure for this kind of data, for example, that there will be stored and processed in Europe, and that everyone will know where they are and what you do with these data. So that's really the opposite, I will say. By the way, I told you also that we are organizing the data altruism and empowering the right under GDPR. So we are extremely careful on this, but we just want to give, let's say, a secured umbrella to do this. So that's what I wanted to say, because I really think this is really the opposite of this question. But thank you for raising, so I can correct it and wait this afternoon to see what is there, or tomorrow, because it will be published tomorrow.
Well, I don't think I'll be able to sleep tonight waiting to see this in the morning. But no, thank you very much. It's a very timely thing. One last question, since we're running out of time. Apologies again for the late start. A question from Richard Gutjahr was remarking that in recent Senate hearings in the US, the Twitter's CEO was talking about the need for more transparency regarding algorithms processing personal data. And of course, we have things in GDPR already, like the right of explanation and so on. What are your thoughts on that? Should we be hoping to see more in the barrage of legislative proposals coming out?
The answer is definitely yes. That's a very important point, and it will be in the DSA. Big platforms will be obliged to be transparent on the algorithm. We will have also, they will be audited also on a regular basis by us, to make sure that we understand, and by the way, that their customers, if I may say so, understand what is behind the algorithm. So I really, this is a very important question, and we will address, as we said in France, sans avoir la main qui tremble, being very tough, these questions, because we know that this is an extremely important question. Maybe just one word on Brexit, because I didn't mention. We of course we are working very carefully on this, and I would like just to say that if the applicable conditions are met, adequacy will be an important facilitator for trade, and essential prerequisite for a close and ambitious cooperation in the area of law enforcement and security. So again, that's a key element of the level playing field with such, of course, a geographically close and closely integrated partner. But of course, we will look at the conditions, at all the conditions, extremely carefully. That's a sensitive subject for me.
Thank you very much for that. I would like to thank both of you for being here with us today and for these very thoughtful comments. And I'd also like to give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to make any closing thoughts based on what we've heard or based on anything else. So I guess over to the Commissioner first.
No, I think thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to exchange with Mr. Schrems. Doing what we do, we are very inclusive, and I know by experience that in order to organize this digital space that I spoke about, we need to engage with all stakeholders. And that's extremely important to make sure that everyone understands what we are doing. By the way, for the proposal that we will put on the table with DGA, DSA, and DMA. We asked everyone to give us their proposals, their reactions, and we received 3,000 contributions. Everyone was able to do this. We are the only continent doing this. We spend weeks and weeks to do this, and then to read everything, to understand where they are. But you know what? At the end of the day, we will take the decision, and I will propose what I believe is good for Europe and our European fellow citizens and companies. But we listen to everybody. And of course, thank you for very much for Mr. Schrems, because of course, he's also an important stakeholder. So I have been very happy to be able to discuss with him, and let's work together to build our own data continent, if I may say so.
Commissioner Breton, thank you very, very much for these thoughtful comments. You're a great public servant. It's a real honor to have you with us today. Mr. Schrems, closing comments from you, if you wish.
Yeah, sorry, we were a bit squeezed. There were a couple of points I still wanted to kind of at least flag, in the sense that they weren't at least not mentioned. I think one super interesting part from a GDPR perspective is how much new legislation that will come out, and as a lawyer, I'm happy to read it and then comment on it. But one thing that I would definitely look into a lot when these proposals come out is how much they, get into conflict with the GDPR. That is something we saw with a couple of the new legislations, that there are elements, even in recitals, that may be used to undermine, used by certain industry sectors to undermine what we actually put forward in the GDPR. Typical example is what was mentioned, anonymization. There's oftentimes technology that is just not there, that is just not really anonymous, that is then used and to actually bypass the laws in the GDPR. Data altruism we have in the GDPR, I think, to a certain extent, before you can just consent to, for example, research with your data. So I think there may be some things that may overlap with what we already have, and I think that would be could partly be problematic. Data reusage, I think that's an extremely important question and super interesting for many parts. In the GDPR sphere as well, there is always the problem with the purpose limitation principles in the charter, which even I think the GDPR goes partly too far. There are parts of the GDPR that may be in conflict with the charter on that itself. And that could also be, parts that may then be hard to wriggle together somehow. But we'll see what the proposals are, and usually all of these things will be debated for a long while anyways before they become law. Hopefully not as long as the GDPR, though.
One can hope. Well, once again, I'd like to thank you both for very thoughtful, very interesting comments. Folks, you've been listening to Bruegel, the economics think tank based in Brussels. We very much appreciate that you were here. This is sort of a digital data week for Bruegel. Tomorrow at 4 o'clock Central European Time, we have another workshop. This one will be dealing with data transfers among the EU, the US, and the UK. So it will touch on some of the same issues. Some interesting speakers there. I happen to be one of them. And I would encourage you to join us there. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your engagement. Once again, thank you so much to Commissioner Breton and to Maximilian Schrems for very interesting and thoughtful comments. And with that, I'd like to close the session. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.